Her tiny feet were bleeding as she ran past the armed guards. Tears carved paths through the dirt on her face, her voice breaking with every desperate breath. "Please help! They're beating my mama!" The warehouse fell silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every weapon was drawn. But the man she had chosen to beg was no ordinary stranger. He was the most feared mafia boss in the entire state. And what he did next would change 3 lives forever. Stay with me until the end, because this story will shock you to the core. Before we begin, hit subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Now let's get back into the story. It was a humid Thursday evening in the industrial district, summer 1995. The abandoned riverside warehouse hummed with tension as a dozen black SUVs surrounded its perimeter, like predators circling prey. This wasn't just any meeting location. This was Daniel Galleon's fortress. Every entrance was guarded by men whose loyalty had been purchased with blood and money in equal measure. Every corner held shadows that watched and reported everything. And inside, the air itself seemed to bend around the presence of absolute power. Daniel Galleon sat at the center of a makeshift conference table, a man whose stillness was more terrifying than other men's violence. At 42, he had built an empire that controlled everything from the docks to the downtown high-rises. His reputation was carved from ice and steel, no mercy, no exceptions, no emotional attachments. His dark eyes registered every detail, every gesture, every shift in the room's atmosphere. His word ended disputes. His silence preceded devastation. And tonight, like every Thursday for the past 8 years, he was conducting business with the precision of a surgeon and the coldness of a winter storm. The conversation moved in careful, measured rhythms. Territory boundaries were redrawn. Profit percentages were negotiated. Problems were identified and solutions were implemented with brutal efficiency. This was how Daniel operated. Methodical, calculated, without sentiment clouding judgment. He had survived longer than any boss in recent history because he understood one fundamental truth that had been burned into his soul years ago. After a loss so devastating it had nearly destroyed him. Emotion was a liability. Attachment was weakness. And weakness got everyone you loved killed. So Daniel Galleon had become concrete, impenetrable, a man who ruled through fear and respect, but never, ever through love. But then something happened that would shatter the carefully constructed walls Daniel had spent a decade building around his heart. The warehouse's steel security door, the one that required 3 separate codes and biometric verification, burst open with a screech of metal that cut through every conversation like a knife. Every head snapped toward the sound. Hands moved to weapons. Bodies tensed for violence. Daniel's head of security, Marcus, lunged toward the entrance, his face twisted with fury at the breach in protocol. But before anyone could react, everyone saw what had caused the impossible intrusion. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, stood trembling just inside the doorway. Her pink dress was torn and stained with something dark that looked too much like blood. Her hair, pulled into 2 small ponytails, was disheveled and tangled. Dirt and tears streaked her beautiful brown face, and her small chest heaved with the exhaustion of someone who had run through hell itself to get here. She looked like a tiny survivor of a war zone, displaced and desperate in a world of armed men and criminal power. The child's eyes swept the warehouse frantically, searching past the weapons and the hostile stares, looking for something she couldn't name but desperately needed. The men stared back in stunned, dangerous silence. Some looked at Marcus, waiting for the order to remove her. Others exchanged glances, confused and irritated that their high-stakes meeting had been compromised by what appeared to be a lost street kid who'd wandered into the wrong building. But the little girl wasn't lost. She was on a mission. Her gaze locked onto Daniel Galleon's position at the center of the room, and something in those tear-filled, terrified eyes recognized authority when she saw it. Maybe it was the way every man in the room seemed to orbit around him. Maybe it was the expensive suit that looked out of place in an abandoned warehouse. Maybe it was the absolute stillness of his posture while chaos erupted around him. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something deeper. A child's primal instinct recognizing the one person in that room who had enough power to actually save her mother's life. Without hesitation, without fear of the guns or the dangerous men blocking her path, she ran straight toward Daniel Gallion. The warehouse held its collective breath. Daniel's lieutenants rose from their seats, hands reaching for weapons. Marcus shouted something, moving to intercept. This was unprecedented. Impossible. No one approached Daniel Gallion uninvited, especially not in the middle of a secured meeting. The breach in security alone was enough to warrant lethal force. But before anyone could reach her, the little girl dodged past Marcus with the desperate agility of someone running for her life. She reached Daniel's table and grabbed his sleeve with both of her small hands. Her tiny fingers clutched the expensive fabric as if it were the only solid thing left in a world that had turned violent and incomprehensible. Her eyes, wide, brown, and filled with a terror no child should ever have to experience, looked up into Daniel's face with an expression that bypassed all his defenses and struck something deep inside him that he thought was dead. And then she spoke the words that would echo in Daniel Gallion's mind for the rest of his life, words that would crack the concrete around his heart and force him to remember what it felt like to care about something more than power and profit. "Please help," she sobbed, her voice breaking with exhaustion and fear. "They're beating my mama. She's gonna die if you don't help. Please, mister. Please." The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the warehouse fixed on Daniel's face, waiting to see how the cold king would react to this impossible, unprecedented intrusion. Would he have the child removed? Would he ignore her plea and return to business? Would he punish his security team for the breach and make an example that would ensure nothing like this ever happened again? Daniel Gallion looked down at the tiny girl clutching his sleeve, at the blood on her dress, at the tears streaming down her face, at the raw, desperate courage it must have taken for her to run past armed guards and burst into a room full of dangerous men. And for the first time in 10 years, something cracked in the ice around his heart. He saw, just for a moment, another child, another loss, another moment when he had been too late, too cold, too detached to save someone who had needed him. Not again. Daniel's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute command. "Everyone out, now." His lieutenants hesitated, confusion crossing their faces. Marcus started to protest. "Boss, we need to—" "I said out." Daniel's eyes never left the little girl's face. "Clear the warehouse. Wait outside. No one enters until I call for you." The room emptied in less than 30 seconds, men filing out with backward glances, unsure of what they'd just witnessed. The steel door closed with a heavy clang, leaving Daniel Gallion alone with the tiny, terrified girl who had just done the impossible. She had made the coldest man in the city care about something other than power. Daniel knelt down slowly, bringing himself to the child's eye level. His voice, usually so hard and commanding, softened to something almost gentle. "Tell me your name, little one." "Nicole," she whispered, still clutching his sleeve like a lifeline. "Nicole," Daniel repeated, and the name felt significant somehow, important. "Tell me everything. Where is your mama? Who hurt her? And how did you find me?" And as Nicole began to speak, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush about gang members and territory disputes, and her mother Deborah lying beaten in their apartment, Daniel Gallion felt the concrete around his heart continue to crack. He had built an empire on the principle that caring about people made you vulnerable. But looking at this brave, terrified little girl who had risked everything to save her mother, Daniel realized something he'd forgotten in 10 years of deliberate coldness. Sometimes being vulnerable was the only way to be truly powerful. Sometimes caring was the strongest thing you could do. And tonight, Daniel Gallion was going to care with all the terrifying resources at his disposal. The Riverside warehouse had been abandoned by legitimate business 15 years ago, left to rust and decay in the industrial wasteland where the city pretended nothing existed. But Daniel Gallion had seen potential in the isolation. He'd purchased it through 3 shell corporations, reinforced the walls with steel plating, installed security systems that rivaled government facilities, and transformed it into something far more valuable than any factory had ever been. A place where power could operate without witnesses, where decisions that shaped the entire criminal underworld could be made in absolute secrecy. Every Thursday at 9 p.m., the warehouse came alive with a different kind of industry. Black SUVs arrived in precise intervals, their windows tinted dark enough to violate every traffic law. Men emerged wearing expensive suits that concealed expensive weapons, their faces hard with the kind of experience that came from surviving in a world where mistakes were measured in body counts. They passed through 3 security checkpoints, each one more thorough than airport screening, each guard trained to kill at the first sign of threat. Inside, the warehouse had been gutted and rebuilt. The main floor held a conference setup that would have looked at home in any corporate boardroom: a long table made of reclaimed wood, leather chairs, state-of-the-art communication equipment. But the similarities to legitimate business ended there. The walls were soundproofed, the windows were reinforced and covered with steel shutters. Armed guards stood at every entrance and exit. And everyone who entered understood that what happened in this room stayed in this room, or you didn't leave at all. Daniel Gallion had built this empire on 3 principles, taught to him through blood and loss. Trust no one completely, show no weakness ever, and never let emotion compromise decision-making. These weren't just guidelines. They were survival mechanisms, carved into his psyche 10 years ago when he'd learned the most brutal lesson of his life. He'd been 32 then, younger and stupider, still believing that power and love could coexist. He'd had a wife, Elena, and a daughter, Sophia, who was 8 years old with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn determination. Daniel had loved them with the kind of intensity that made him vulnerable, that made him distracted, that made him human in a world that punished humanity with death. His enemies had noticed. They'd seen the weakness, the soft spot in the armor of a man who was rapidly becoming too powerful, too dominant in territories they wanted for themselves. So they'd acted with the ruthless efficiency that Daniel himself would later adopt. They'd targeted his family while he was handling business across state lines. They'd been thorough, professional, sending a message that reverberated through every criminal network in 3 states. By the time Daniel had returned, Elena and Sophia were gone. Not kidnapped for ransom, not held as leverage, just gone, eliminated as efficiently as clearing obstacles from a business plan. Daniel had hunted down every person involved. It had taken him 6 months, and when he was finished, the rival organization that had killed his family no longer existed in any form. But the victory had been hollow, meaningless, because no amount of vengeance could bring back the 2 people who'd made his life something more than an endless calculation of risk and profit. So Daniel Gallion had made a choice. He would never be vulnerable again. He would become exactly what his enemies had feared, a force of pure, uncompromising power, guided by logic and strategy rather than sentiment and emotion. He would build an empire so vast and so terrifying that no one would ever dare to strike at him again. And for 10 years, it had worked. He'd expanded his territories, absorbed rival operations, eliminated threats with surgical precision. He'd become the Cold King, the man whose word was law and whose heart was rumored to be as dead as the concrete floors of his warehouse. His lieutenants feared him, his enemies respected him. His allies kept their distance, understanding that Daniel Gallion didn't have friends, only strategic partnerships that lasted exactly as long as they remained mutually beneficial. He conducted his business with the efficiency of a machine. Territory disputes were resolved through calculated violence or negotiated settlements based on profit analysis. Personnel problems were handled immediately and permanently. Expansion opportunities were evaluated based on risk-reward ratios that Daniel could calculate in his head faster than most people could use calculators. Emotion never entered the equation. When one of his men made a mistake that cost money or exposed the organization to risk, Daniel eliminated the problem without hesitation or regret. When competitors made moves against his interests, he responded with overwhelming force, calibrated precisely to send the right message. When opportunities arose to increase profit through actions that might have troubled a man with a conscience, Daniel took those opportunities because conscience was a luxury he'd buried alongside his wife and daughter. His reputation had become mythical. Stories circulated through the underworld about Daniel Galleon's ice-cold pragmatism, his absolute lack of mercy, his ability to make life-or-death decisions with the emotional investment of someone choosing between coffee brands. Some said he was inhuman. Others whispered that he'd sold his soul for power. A few suggested he was simply the most dangerous kind of criminal, one who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing to fear. They were all partially right. Daniel Galleon had indeed become something other than fully human. He'd deliberately killed the part of himself that felt compassion, empathy, attachment. He'd performed surgery on his own psyche, excising the vulnerabilities that had gotten his family murdered. What remained was pure function, pure purpose, pure power. His Thursday meetings were the pinnacle of this transformation. Surrounded by his inner circle, 8 lieutenants who controlled different aspects of his empire, Daniel would spend 3 hours dissecting the week's activities, addressing problems, making decisions that affected hundreds of people's lives and millions of dollars in illegal revenue. He spoke in brief, precise sentences. He listened with absolute attention to detail. He never raised his voice because he didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood that Daniel's quiet pronouncements carried more weight than other men's shouted threats. Tonight's meeting had been proceeding exactly as planned. Territory adjustments in the port district, new distribution channels for the gambling operations, a personnel issue in the loan division that required permanent resolution. Daniel had been in the middle of explaining why they needed to distance themselves from a rival organization's drug operation. Too much law enforcement attention, too little profit margin, when the impossible had happened. The steel door had burst open, and a tiny girl in a blood-stained pink dress had run straight toward him, shattering the carefully controlled environment of his cold kingdom, with nothing more than tears and desperation and a plea that bypassed every defense he'd spent 10 years building. "Please help! They're beating my mama!" And in that moment, Daniel Galleon's concrete heart had cracked. Deborah Clarkson had learned early that the world didn't owe you fairness, but that didn't stop you from fighting for it anyway. At 31, she carried herself with the dignified exhaustion of someone who'd been swimming upstream for so long that the current had become familiar, almost comfortable in its relentless pressure. She worked 2 jobs because one wasn't enough to keep her and Nicole in their small 2-bedroom apartment on Riverside Avenue. Mornings belonged to the nursing home on 5th Street, where she cleaned rooms and assisted the elderly residents with the kind of patient kindness that came naturally despite the minimum wage. Evenings belonged to the diner on Marshall Boulevard, where she waited tables and smiled through the casual disrespect of customers who saw service workers as furniture. Between those jobs, in the precious hours that remained, Deborah was Nicole's entire world. She helped with homework at the kitchen table, their heads bent together over first-grade spelling words. She made meals stretch. Macaroni and cheese could last 3 days if you added frozen vegetables and creativity. She read stories before bed, voices and sound effects included, making Nicole giggle even when Deborah's feet ached and her back screamed from 12 hours of physical labor. This was Deborah's life, and she'd made peace with it. She'd chosen to keep Nicole when her boyfriend, a charming mistake she'd met at 19, had disappeared the moment pregnancy became reality. She'd chosen to work herself to exhaustion rather than accept welfare that came with judgment and stigma. She'd chosen dignity over ease, independence over help, because she wanted Nicole to see what it meant to fight for yourself and the people you loved. But peace was a luxury that required safe ground, and Riverside Avenue had become a battlefield. The Riverside crew had moved into the neighborhood 3 years ago, expanding from their original territory 2 miles north. They were a mid-level drug operation, too small to be noticed by major law enforcement, but large enough to terrorize the few blocks they controlled. Their business model was simple: sell product, defend territory, eliminate competition or witnesses who threatened profit margins. Deborah had watched the transformation happen with the helpless awareness of someone witnessing a slow-motion disaster. The bodega on the corner had changed ownership after the original owner was hospitalized for refusing to pay rent to people who didn't own the building. The community center where Nicole had attended after-school programs had closed after repeated vandalism made insurance impossible. Young men who'd grown up on the street either joined the crew or moved away, leaving only those too desperate or too trapped to escape. The crew operated from 3 houses on Deborah's block, conducting business with the casual openness of people who knew the police didn't care enough to intervene. Deborah had learned to keep her head down, to walk past the transactions happening on her own stoop, to ignore the sounds of violence that sometimes echoed through summer nights when windows were open and pretending not to hear became a survival skill. She'd taught Nicole the rules. Don't make eye contact with the men on the corner. Don't answer questions if strangers approach. Run straight home from school and lock the door immediately. Nicole, smart and observant beyond her 6 years, had learned quickly. She'd become adept at the peculiar vigilance required of children growing up in war zones, where the enemy wore regular clothes and the battlefield was your own street. But yesterday, the war had found them anyway. Deborah had been coming home from her morning shift, tired but thinking about the hours she had before the evening shift, planning to spend them with Nicole, maybe walk to the library, maybe make cookies if the budget allowed. She'd been carrying 2 bags of groceries, carefully selected for maximum nutrition and minimum cost, when she'd turned onto her street and seen something that made her blood run cold. Marcus, one of the crew's enforcers, was standing outside her apartment building with 2 other men Deborah didn't recognize. They were arguing with Carlos, the building superintendent, who was gesturing angrily and shouting something about property damage and police. Deborah had hesitated, instinct screaming at her to turn around, to wait somewhere safe until whatever was happening finished happening. But Nicole was inside the apartment. School had let out early for teacher conferences, and Mrs. Chen from 3B was watching her. Deborah couldn't leave her daughter in a building where the crew was conducting business, so she'd approached with the careful neutrality of someone trying to become invisible, planning to slip past the confrontation and get upstairs to Nicole. But Marcus had noticed her. His eyes had tracked her movement with the predatory attention of someone who saw everyone in the neighborhood as either resources or obstacles. "Yo, Deborah," he'd called out, his voice carrying false friendliness that made her skin crawl. "Come here for a minute. We need to talk to you." Deborah had stopped, groceries heavy in her arms, calculating odds that all came up bad. "I need to check on my daughter. Whatever you need, maybe we can talk later." "Now," Marcus had interrupted, the friendliness evaporating. "We talk now." The conversation that followed had been brief and terrifying. The crew needed Deborah's apartment. Not permanently, just for a few hours every week. A place to conduct business away from their usual spots, somewhere the police wouldn't think to look. Nice, respectable building. Single mother, no man around to complicate things. Perfect cover. Deborah had refused with the desperate politeness of someone who knew refusal was dangerous, but couldn't bring herself to agree. "I can't. My daughter lives here. I can't have that around her. Please, there must be somewhere else." Marcus's expression had hardened. This ain't a negotiation. You got 24 hours to think about it. Tomorrow night we start using your place. You cooperate, we make it worth your while. You don't. He'd shrugged, the gesture loaded with threat. Bad things happen to people who don't cooperate. Real bad things. Deborah had fled upstairs, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unlock her door. She'd held Nicole tight that night, making plans she couldn't quite formulate. Move? With what money? Go to the police? They'd laugh her out of the station, or worse, their investigation would mark her as a snitch and make her a target. Run? To where? She had no family, no savings, no safety net. By this evening, the 24 hours were up. Deborah had been preparing dinner, trying to keep her fear hidden from Nicole, when the knock had come. Not polite, not patient. The kind of knock that said time was up and consequences were beginning. She'd opened the door to find Marcus and 4 other crew members, their intentions written clearly in their expressions and body language. This was enforcement. This was the lesson taught to everyone in the neighborhood who dared to say no. Last chance, Marcus had said. You cooperating or not? Deborah had tried one more time. Please, just leave us alone. We're not hurting anyone. My daughter. The first punch had cut off her words and her hope. She'd tried to fight back, tried to scream, tried to do something other than become a victim in her own doorway. But there were 5 of them, and 1 of her, and the lesson they were teaching was designed to be permanent. Through the pain and fear, Deborah's only thought was Nicole. Nicole was inside, hiding in her closet, like Deborah had taught her. Nicole was 6 years old and listening to her mother being beaten in their own home. Nicole would be traumatized, damaged, changed forever by this violence. As consciousness started to slip away, Deborah's last coherent thought was a prayer. Please, someone save my baby. She didn't know that Nicole, brave and desperate beyond her years, had already slipped out the fire escape window. She didn't know that Nicole was running through the industrial district with her mother's screams echoing in her memory. She didn't know that Nicole had seen the black SUVs and made a decision that would change all their lives. She didn't know that salvation was coming, delivered by the most dangerous man in the city, someone who'd become powerful by turning his heart to stone, but who was about to remember what it felt like to care. Nicole's feet hurt so badly she could barely feel them anymore. She'd been running for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Her small lungs burning with each breath, her pink dress torn and stained from when she'd scraped against the fire escape railing. She'd run without direction at first, just away, away from the sounds of her mother's screams, away from the horrible laughter of the men who were hurting her, away from their apartment that was supposed to be safe but had become a nightmare. But running away wasn't helping Mama. Nicole had stopped at the corner of Industrial Avenue, her chest heaving, her mind racing with the terrible knowledge that she was 6 years old and alone, and her mother was dying, and there was nothing she could do about it. Except there had to be something. There had to be someone. Mama had always told her that when you were in real trouble, you found a police officer. But Nicole had never seen police officers in their neighborhood. The few times she'd noticed their cars, they'd driven through without stopping, like the whole street was invisible to them. And Marcus and his friends were always there, always watching. If she went to find police, how long would that take? Would they even believe her? Would they come in time? Nicole wiped her tears with the back of her hand, trying to think like Mama always said to think. What's the smart thing? What's the thing that actually works? She'd heard Marcus and the others talk sometimes when she was walking home from school and they were on the corner. They talked about territory and bosses and who controlled what. They talked with fear in their voices about the people above them, the ones who could make them disappear if they messed up. They talked about power that was bigger than guns, bigger than their crew, bigger than anything Nicole could imagine. If Mama needed help that the police couldn't give, maybe she needed the kind of help that scared people like Marcus. Nicole had started running again, but this time with purpose. She followed Industrial Avenue deeper into the part of the neighborhood that Mama always warned her to avoid, where the old factories stood empty, and the streetlights were broken, and the buildings looked like they might fall down if you breathed on them too hard. That's when she saw them. The SUVs. There were at least a dozen of them, all black, all expensive looking, arranged in a pattern around one particular warehouse that looked less abandoned than the others. Men stood next to the vehicles, and even from a distance Nicole could tell these weren't regular people. They stood too still, too alert. They wore nice clothes that looked wrong in this broken-down place. They had the kind of presence that made Nicole think of the nature documentaries she'd watched at school, predators scanning their territory. This was power, real power, the kind that Marcus was afraid of. Nicole's heart hammered in her chest as she approached, staying close to the shadows of the building across the street. She watched the warehouse entrance, trying to figure out how to get inside. There were guards everywhere, two at the main door, others walking the perimeter. This was the most secure place she'd ever seen outside of banks and movies. But her mother was dying. The image of Mama's face, of the blood, of her trying to shield Nicole with her own body, it pushed Nicole forward when everything else said to run away. She waited, watching with the patient desperation of someone who had no choice but to wait for an opening. 10 minutes passed. 15. Then one of the perimeter guards received a phone call, turning away and walking several steps from his post to hear better in the industrial noise. Nicole didn't think. She ran. Her small size was an advantage now. She was low to the ground, fast, able to slip between parked vehicles where an adult would have been spotted immediately. She made it to the warehouse wall, pressing herself against the cold concrete, breathing so hard she thought they must be able to hear her. The guard finished his call and returned to his position. He hadn't seen her. Nicole had maybe 2 minutes before another perimeter check, before someone noticed a 6-year-old girl pressed against the building in a torn pink dress. She moved along the wall, searching for any entrance, any gap. The main door was impossible. Too many guards, too much attention. But old buildings always had other ways in. Mama had taught her that when they'd explored the neighborhood together, back when it felt safer. There, a side entrance, partially hidden by a dumpster, with a single guard who was checking his phone instead of his surroundings. The door was slightly ajar, propped open with a brick, probably for ventilation. Nicole calculated the distance. 12 feet, maybe 15. If she ran fast enough, if the guard stayed distracted for just 10 more seconds, if she could slip through before he noticed. She didn't let herself finish the thought. She just ran, her feet slapped against the pavement. The guard's head started to turn. Nicole dove through the narrow gap between the dumpster and the door, scraping her arm against the metal edge but not stopping, not slowing down. She pushed through the partially open door, and suddenly she was inside. The temperature change hit her first. Cooler air, the smell of cigarettes and expensive cologne. Then the voices, dozens of them, speaking in low, serious tones. Nicole found herself in a dim corridor, fluorescent lights flickering overhead, the concrete floor painted industrial gray. At the end of the corridor was another door, and through it she could hear the voices more clearly. Behind her she heard the guard shouting, "Hey! Someone just went inside! Breach! We have a breach!" Nicole ran toward the voices, toward the power she hoped could save her mother. She burst through the final door into a room full of dangerous men in expensive suits, all of whom turned to stare at her with expressions ranging from shock to fury. But Nicole didn't see them. She only saw the man at the center of the table, the one everyone else seemed to orbit around, the one whose stillness suggested more power than all the others' movement combined. His dark eyes fixed on her with the intensity of someone used to seeing everything, understanding everything, controlling everything. This was the boss, the real boss, the one people like Marcus feared. Nicole ran straight toward him, dodging between chairs, ignoring the hands that reached out to stop her. She grabbed his sleeve with both of her small hands, looking up into a face that seemed carved from stone, but had eyes that were somehow still human underneath all that hardness. "Please help," Nicole sobbed, all her terror and desperation pouring out in words she could barely form. "They're beating my mama. She's gonna die if you don't help. Please, mister, please." The room erupted around her, shouting, movement, the sound of weapons being drawn. But Nicole didn't let go of the man's sleeve. She held on like it was the only solid thing in a world that had tilted sideways, her eyes locked on his face, pleading with everything she had left. For a long moment, the man just stared at her. His expression was unreadable, carved from ice and calculation. Nicole felt her hope starting to crack, felt the certainty that she'd made a terrible mistake, that powerful men didn't help little girls who interrupted their important meetings. Then something shifted in his eyes, something that looked almost like recognition, almost like pain. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but carried absolute authority. "Everyone out, now." The warehouse emptied with reluctant efficiency, Daniel's lieutenants exchanging glances that questioned whether their boss had lost his mind. Marcus lingered at the door, his jaw tight with disapproval. "Boss, this is a security breach. We need to—" "Later," Daniel said, voice carrying finality. "Wait outside." The steel door closed with a heavy clang. Daniel remained kneeling at Nicole's eye level, aware that towering over her would only add terror. Up close, he saw details obscured by chaos. The scrape on her arm still bleeding, dirt under her fingernails from climbing, her small chest heaving with exhaustion. But her eyes held him, brown and wide, filled with tears and terror and desperate, stubborn courage that reminded him of someone he'd spent 10 years trying to forget. Sophia had looked at him like that once. The memory hit with physical force, breaking through defenses he'd thought impenetrable. Sophia had been 8, old enough to understand the men who'd broken into their home meant harm. In that final moment, as Daniel was held at gunpoint and forced to watch, Sophia had looked at him with that same expression, terrified, but believing her father could fix anything. He'd failed her. "Sir?" Nicole's voice pulled him back. "Are you gonna help?" Daniel forced himself to focus. "Tell me your name." "Nicole. Nicole Clarkson." "Nicole. I need you to tell me everything. Start from the beginning." The words tumbled out. Men who'd come to their apartment demanding to use it for business, her mama saying no, them coming back when time was up. Mama tried to stop them. She told me to hide in my closet, but I could hear everything. They were hurting her so bad. She was screaming and then she stopped, and that was worse because— The words dissolved into sobs. Daniel felt something twist in his chest, concrete cracking with every word this child spoke. This wasn't about territory or profit. This was about a mother protecting her child and being brutalized for refusing to compromise her daughter's safety. This was about a 6-year-old brave enough to run through danger, slip past armed guards, and beg help from the city's most feared man. This was everything Daniel had told himself didn't matter anymore. "Where's your apartment?" His voice stayed steady despite the chaos inside. "Riverside Avenue, Building 847, Apartment 3C. Nicole's grip tightened. "Please, what if Mama's—" "She's not," Daniel said with certainty he needed her to believe. "We're getting her help. Right now." He stood, pulling his phone out. Nicole still held his sleeve as if afraid he'd disappear. Daniel found he didn't mind. 10 years avoiding human connection, and this child had bypassed every defense with tears and courage. He dialed Marcus. "Get Dr. Patterson here immediately. Life or death. 10 minutes. "Boss? Who?" "Just do it." He dialed another number. "Tony, tactical team. 6 men, armed, 5 minutes. Riverside Avenue, Building 847. We're collecting someone held by the Riverside crew. Yes. I know it's not our territory. Handle it. 3 more calls. His medic, his driver, a lieutenant to secure safe medical treatment. With each call, Daniel moved further from the cold boss who'd sat at that table 20 minutes ago. Making decisions based on emotion now, on a need to protect he'd thought was buried. His men would question this. They'd wonder why he was mobilizing resources for a street-level dispute with no profit or strategic advantage. They'd see weakness. He didn't care. Nicole still looked up with those eyes that reminded him of Sophia. Daniel realized something profound. He'd spent 10 years trying to kill his capacity to care because caring made him vulnerable. But he'd actually sentenced himself to living death, where power meant nothing and survival felt empty. Maybe vulnerability wasn't weakness. Maybe caring gave power meaning. Nicole, he said, kneeling again, I'm going to save your mama, but you need to trust me and do exactly what I say. Can you do that? Nicole nodded, fresh tears spilling, but different now, less desperate, more hopeful. What's your name? She asked quietly. If you're saving Mama, I should know. Daniel hesitated. His name carried weight, reputation, fear, but this little girl had reminded him some things mattered more than reputation. Daniel, my name is Daniel Gallion. Thank you, Mr. Daniel. Her voice was small but sincere. Thank you for listening. Daniel's throat tightened with emotion he'd thought he'd never feel again. He gently touched the top of Nicole's head, a gesture of protection and promise. Your mama is going to be okay, he said. I give you my word. As Daniel Gallion made that promise to a 6-year-old he'd known for 10 minutes, the last concrete around his heart crumbled to dust. He was vulnerable again, could be hurt again, could lose again, but for the first time in 10 years, he was truly alive. Dr. James Patterson arrived in 8 minutes, which was faster than Daniel had expected but still felt like an eternity. He burst through the warehouse door carrying his medical bag, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion when he saw Daniel kneeling beside a small girl in a blood-stained dress. Boss, what? How fast can you stabilize someone with severe trauma? Multiple contusions, possible internal bleeding, head injury? Daniel's questions came rapid-fire, clinical. Patterson's professionalism kicked in immediately. Depends on severity. If they're conscious and breathing, I can stabilize in minutes. If there's internal hemorrhaging or cranial trauma, they need a hospital within the hour or we don't have an hour. Daniel stood, pulling Nicole gently to her feet. Nicole, Dr. Patterson is going to come with us. He's going to help your mama. Nicole looked at the doctor with desperate hope. You can make her better? Patterson knelt down, his voice softening in the way doctors learned when talking to scared children. I'm going to do everything I can, sweetheart. But I need you to tell me exactly what happened to your mom. Can you do that? Nicole nodded, and Daniel watched as she recounted the attack with heartbreaking detail. 5 men, her mother trying to fight back, the sound of fists hitting flesh. How long the beating had lasted. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe more. Nicole wasn't sure because time had stopped meaning anything. The way her mother had eventually stopped making sounds, which terrified Nicole more than the screaming had. Patterson's face grew grimmer with each detail. When Nicole finished, he looked at Daniel with an expression that said the situation was as bad as they'd feared. We need to move now, Patterson said. If she's been unconscious for more than 20 minutes with head trauma. Tony's already mobilizing, Daniel interrupted, checking his watch. It had been 6 minutes since he'd made the call. His team should be armed and ready. We leave in 2 minutes. The warehouse door opened and Marcus entered, followed by 6 of Daniel's most trusted enforcers. They were dressed in tactical gear, weapons visible but not drawn, moving with the coordinated efficiency of men who'd worked together for years. Tony, Daniel's most reliable lieutenant, stepped forward. We're ready, boss. 3 vehicles, full tactical loadout. But I need to know, are we expecting resistance? The Riverside crew, 5 men, possibly more by now. They're holding the apartment where the victim is located. Daniel's voice carried the cold authority that his men recognized, even if the mission itself was unprecedented. Primary objective: secure Deborah Clarkson and get her medical attention. Secondary objective: capture the attackers alive if possible. I want them brought back here. Tony's eyebrows rose slightly. Capturing targets alive was always more complicated than the alternative, but he nodded. Understood. Rules of engagement? Minimum necessary force to secure the objectives. But if anyone threatens Dr. Patterson or the victim, you have authorization to eliminate the threat. Daniel paused, his gaze sweeping across his men. This is non-negotiable. We're getting that woman out alive, whatever it takes. The men exchanged glances. This wasn't how Daniel Gallion operated. He didn't mobilize tactical teams for civilians who weren't connected to the business. He didn't risk exposure for humanitarian missions, but they'd all learned long ago not to question the boss's orders, no matter how unusual. Move out, Daniel commanded. The team filed out toward the waiting SUVs. Daniel turned to Nicole, who'd been standing silently, her small hand still gripping his sleeve. Nicole, I need you to stay here where it's safe. Marcus is going to— No! Nicole's voice was sharp with panic. I need to see Mama. I need to know she's okay. Daniel started to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. She'd already been through hell tonight, separated from her mother, running through dangerous streets, breaching his fortress. Forcing her to wait in a warehouse surrounded by strangers might break what little composure she had left. He made a decision that 10 years ago would have been automatic but now felt like stepping off a cliff. She comes with us, he said to Marcus, who looked like he wanted to protest but knew better. In my vehicle. If there's any indication of danger, you get her out immediately. Boss, that's non-negotiable, Daniel repeated, using the phrase that ended all discussion. He scooped Nicole up, surprised by how light she was, how small and fragile. She wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face against his shoulder, and Daniel felt something ancient and protective surge through him. The same instinct that had once made him a father, before he'd forced himself to forget what that felt like. They moved to the lead SUV, Patterson climbing in beside them with his medical bag. Tony took the front passenger seat, communicating with the other vehicles through his radio. The convoy pulled out of the warehouse district with practiced precision, 3 black SUVs moving through the city like sharks through water. Nicole lifted her head from Daniel's shoulder as they drove. Mr. Daniel, what if we're too late? What if Mama's already— We're not too late, Daniel said with a certainty he didn't entirely feel. Your mama is strong, Nicole. She fought to protect you. That kind of strength doesn't give up easily. How do you know? Because I once knew someone just as strong, Daniel thought. Because Elena fought too, even when she knew it was hopeless. Because love makes people stronger than they should be, gives them the power to endure impossible things. I just know, he said instead. The convoy turned onto Riverside Avenue. Tony spoke into his radio, coordinating the approach. 2 vehicles would secure the perimeter. The lead vehicle would breach the apartment. Standard tactical procedure, executed with the efficiency that made Daniel's organization the most feared in the state. But as they pulled up to Building 847, Daniel felt none of the cold calculation that usually accompanied his operations. He felt something that terrified him more than any enemy ever had. He felt invested. He cared whether this mission succeeded. He cared whether Deborah Clarkson lived or died. He cared about the little girl whose arms were wrapped around his neck like he was her last hope in the world. 10 years of careful emotional detachment, shattered by a 6-year-old in a pink dress. Stay in the vehicle, Daniel told Nicole as they stopped. No matter what you hear, you stay here with Marcus. Understand? Nicole nodded reluctantly. Daniel stepped out into the humid evening air, Patterson beside him, Tony and the tactical team fanning out with practiced precision. The apartment building looked like hundreds of others in this neighborhood, tired, worn down, barely maintained. Somewhere inside, a woman was dying or already dead, and 5 men were probably celebrating what they thought was a successful lesson in obedience. They had no idea what was coming for them. Daniel Gallienne had spent 10 years being the cold king, the ruthless boss who calculated every decision based on profit and power. Tonight, he was something far more dangerous. He was a man who cared. Tony's team breached apartment 3C with brutal efficiency. The door came down with one kick, and 4 armed men poured through the entrance with weapons raised. Daniel followed with Patterson, leaving Nicole in the SUV with Marcus despite her desperate protests. The scene inside made Daniel's blood run cold in a way that violence rarely did anymore. Deborah Clarkson lay crumpled near the kitchen entrance, her face swollen almost beyond recognition. Blood pooled beneath her head, staining the worn linen carpet dark. Her breathing was shallow, labored, each breath rattling in her chest like something was broken inside. The apartment itself showed signs of struggle: overturned furniture, broken dishes, blood spattered on the walls. 3 men were still there, lounging on the sofa like they owned the place, drinking beer and laughing about something. They looked up when Daniel's team entered, their expressions shifting from surprise to fear to calculation in rapid succession. "Hands!" Tony barked. "On your heads now!" The men complied slowly, recognizing the kind of firepower and organization that didn't leave room for heroics. One of them, a kid who couldn't be older than 20, started to speak. "Look, man, we don't want trouble. This is Riverside Crew territory and—" "Shut up," Daniel said quietly, and the kid's mouth snapped closed. Something in Daniel's voice and his presence communicated that speaking again would be the last mistake he ever made. Patterson was already on his knees beside Deborah, fingers checking her pulse, his other hand gently examining her injuries. "She's alive. Pulse weak but steady. Severe head trauma. Possible skull fracture. Definitely multiple broken ribs. I need to move her carefully." "Do it," Daniel said. "Tony, help him. The rest of you secure these 3. Zip ties, blindfolds. They're coming with us." The operation proceeded with practiced coordination. Patterson and Tony carefully lifted Deborah onto a portable stretcher that had been in Patterson's medical kit. The 3 gang members were secured and led out at gunpoint, their bravado completely evaporated. Daniel took one last look around the apartment before leaving. It was a small place, clean, despite the chaos of the attack. A child's drawings hung on the refrigerator, crude stick figures labeled Mama and Me, rainbows and flowers colored with the enthusiastic imprecision of a 6-year-old. A stack of bills sat on the kitchen counter, organized by due date. A single pair of women's work shoes by the door, worn down at the heels from too many hours standing. This was a home where someone worked hard and loved fiercely and tried to build something decent in a neighborhood that made decency dangerous. Daniel felt rage building in his chest, cold and precise. Not the hot, impulsive anger of young men who fought over insults and territory. This was something older, more purposeful. The fury of someone who'd seen too much cruelty and decided that some lines couldn't be crossed without consequences. Outside, Nicole broke free from Marcus's grip and ran to the stretcher where her mother lay unconscious. "Mama! Mama, wake up!" Patterson caught Nicole gently before she could touch her mother's injuries. "Sweetheart, your mama is hurt very badly. I need to get her to a hospital right now, but I promise you, I'm going to take care of her. Do you trust me?" Nicole looked at Daniel, tears streaming down her face. Daniel nodded. "Okay," Nicole whispered. "Get her to St. Vincent's private wing," Daniel told Patterson. "Use my name. They'll give you whatever you need. Tony goes with you for security. Nobody gets near that woman except authorized medical staff." Patterson and Tony loaded Deborah into the second SUV, Nicole climbing in beside them. Daniel watched the vehicle pull away, red taillights disappearing into the humid night. Then he turned to the remaining men and the 3 captured gang members who were being held at gunpoint near the 3rd vehicle. "Take them to the warehouse," Daniel said. "The secure room in the back. I'll be there shortly." "Boss, what about the rest of the Riverside crew?" one of his men asked. "There's at least a dozen more operating out of the houses 2 blocks over." Daniel pulled out his phone and dialed a number he used only for the most serious situations. When the voice answered, Daniel spoke with absolute clarity. "This is Galleon. I'm issuing a code red on the Riverside crew. Full operation. I want every member rounded up, every location secured, every asset frozen. Use whoever you need, pay whatever it costs. I want them eliminated completely, not negotiated with, not bought out." Eliminated. There was a pause on the other end. Code Red was the nuclear option, the authorization that mobilized Daniel's entire organization toward a single objective. It was expensive, exposed resources that were usually kept separate, and drew attention that was normally avoided. Daniel had only issued it twice before, both times against major threats to his empire. "The Riverside crew?" the voice asked, confusion evident. "Boss, they're small time. Street-level dealers. This seems like they beat a woman nearly to death in front of her 6-year-old daughter," Daniel interrupted, his voice cold as winter stone. "They did it because she refused to let them use her home for their business. They did it to send a message about what happens when people say no to them." Silence on the line. "I'm sending a different message," Daniel continued. "I'm sending the message that this neighborhood is now under my protection. Anyone who preys on civilians, anyone who brutalizes mothers in front of their children, anyone who mistakes cruelty for power, they don't exist anymore. Am I clear?" "Crystal clear, boss. Code red authorized. We'll have results by morning." Daniel ended the call and looked at the remaining men around him. They were watching him with expressions that mixed respect with uncertainty. This wasn't how Daniel Galleon operated. He was calculated, strategic, never emotional. But looking up at apartment 3C, at the window where a little girl had lived until tonight in a home that should have been safe, Daniel realized he didn't care about operating the way he used to. Some things were worth the exposure. Some things were worth the risk. Some things reminded you why power existed in the first place, not to accumulate wealth or territory, but to protect the people who couldn't protect themselves. "Secure the building," Daniel ordered. "I want guards on every entrance until the code red is complete. Nobody from the Riverside crew comes back here, ever." As his men moved to comply, Daniel looked once more at the apartment window, at the faint light still burning inside. He'd failed to protect Elena and Sophia 10 years ago. He'd been forced to watch them die while he was held helpless. But tonight, he'd saved someone. Maybe just barely, maybe just in time. And if that meant declaring war on every street gang in the city, if that meant exposing himself and his organization, if that meant caring again and being vulnerable again and risking everything he'd built, so be it. The Cold King was dead. Something more dangerous had taken his place. Daniel returned to the warehouse 90 minutes later, after confirming that Deborah had been admitted to St. Vincent's private wing and was stable enough for emergency surgery. Patterson had been cautiously optimistic. The skull fracture was serious but operable, the internal bleeding was being controlled. She might survive. Might. Nicole had refused to leave her mother's side, so Daniel had stationed 2 guards outside the surgical suite with instructions that no one entered without his explicit authorization. The hospital administrator, recognizing Daniel's name and the weight it carried, had asked no questions and promised complete discretion. Now, walking into the secure room at the back of his warehouse, Daniel carried that cautious optimism like armor against what he was about to do. The 3 men from the apartment were zip-tied to chairs, their blindfolds removed. They looked younger in the harsh fluorescent light, mid-20s, maybe 30 at most. The kind of men who'd grown up in neighborhoods where violence was currency and cruelty was a ladder to climb. 2 of them looked defiant, chins raised despite their circumstances. The third, the kid who'd tried to speak earlier, looked terrified. Marcus stood nearby with 2 other guards, all armed, all watching Daniel's face for instructions. This kind of interrogation usually followed a script: extract information, determine usefulness, make strategic decisions about elimination or incorporation. Clean, efficient, emotionless. But Daniel's hands were shaking slightly with suppressed rage, and he knew this wouldn't be that kind of interrogation. Names? He said quietly. The defiant ones stayed silent. The scared kid spoke immediately. I'm Devin. That's Marcus. Not your Marcus, different Marcus. And that's Juice. Devin, Daniel repeated, moving to stand directly in front of the young man. How old are you? 22. You have family? Mother, siblings? Devin hesitated, confused by the question. Yeah, my mom and my little sister. She's 14. You love them? What kind of question? Yeah, I love them. What's this about? Daniel turned to the other two. You? Family? The one called Marcus, Street Marcus, Daniel mentally labeled him to distinguish from his own head of security, spat on the floor. We ain't telling you shit. You know who we work for? You know what happens when… Daniel moved so fast that even his own men barely saw it. One moment he was standing still. The next, his hand was around Street Marcus's throat, squeezing with controlled force that cut off air without crushing the windpipe. I know exactly who you work for, Daniel said, his voice deadly calm. The Riverside Crew. Mid-level operation, about 40 members, running drugs and protection rackets in a 6-block radius. Your boss is someone who calls himself Prophet, real name Darius Webb, operates out of a house on Montgomery Street. You move maybe $200,000 in product monthly, pay up to a larger organization that I could name but won't. You're small-time, insignificant, easily replaced. He released Street Marcus, who gasped for air, all defiance gone from his eyes. Now, Daniel continued, let's talk about Deborah Clarkson, the woman you beat nearly to death tonight. Tell me why. Devin spoke first, words tumbling out. She wouldn't cooperate. We needed a clean place to move product, somewhere the cops wouldn't look. Her apartment was perfect. Single mom, keeps to herself, nobody watching. We offered to pay her. She said no. So we had to make an example, you know? Can't let people think they can just refuse. So you beat her unconscious in front of her 6-year-old daughter, Daniel interrupted. You broke her ribs, fractured her skull, left her bleeding on her kitchen floor. To make an example. It's business, man, Street Marcus wheezed. Territory control. You're in the game, you know how it works. People need to know there's consequences. Consequences, Daniel repeated, the word tasting like poison. He turned away from them, looking at his own men instead. Marcus, how long have you worked for me? 12 years, boss, his head of security answered. In those 12 years, have I ever ordered you to brutalize a civilian, a mother, someone who wasn't in the game, who was just trying to live their life? Marcus didn't hesitate. Never. Have I ever ordered violence against children or in front of children? Never. Daniel turned back to the 3 captured men. You see, that's where you're wrong about how this works. Power without limits isn't power, it's chaos. It's weakness pretending to be strength. You brutalized Deborah Clarkson because you thought it made you powerful. Because you thought fear was the same as respect. Because you're small men playing at being dangerous. He moved closer, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, but carrying more menace than any shout. But now you've learned something important. You've learned there are actual dangerous men in this world. Men with real power, and you've learned that real power has rules. What rules? Juice finally spoke, his voice cracking. You're gonna kill us anyway. Just do it. My rules, Daniel said. Rule 1. You don't prey on civilians who aren't in the game. Rule 2. You don't harm children or hurt people in front of children. Rule 3. When someone with real power tells you a neighborhood is off limits, you listen. He gestured to Marcus. Bring in the others. The door opened and 6 more men were brought in, the rest of the Riverside crew that Daniel's Code Red operation had rounded up in the past 90 minutes. They were in various states of injury, all restrained, all looking around the warehouse with the dawning realization that they'd miscalculated badly. Riverside crew, Daniel announced to the room. You've been operating in my city for 3 years. I've ignored you because you were small, contained, not worth my attention. But tonight, you crossed a line. You brutalized an innocent woman in front of her child. You made a 6-year-old girl run through dangerous streets looking for help because her mother was dying. He let the silence stretch, let them see the fury barely contained beneath his calm exterior. That ends now. The Riverside crew ceases to exist as of tonight. Your operations are shut down, your territories are forfeit, your product is confiscated. The neighborhood you terrorized is now under my protection. Anyone who even thinks about conducting business on those streets answers to me. You can't. Prophet, the crew leader, started to protest. I already have, Daniel interrupted. Your stash houses are being cleared as we speak. Your dealers are being given a choice: walk away from the game entirely or join organizations that understand rules. Your assets are being absorbed or destroyed. You're finished. He turned to his men. These 9 are going to deliver a message for me. Take them to the edge of the state line. Tell them if they're ever seen in this city again, if they ever come near Riverside Avenue, if they ever even think about Deborah or Nicole Clarkson, they disappear permanently. No negotiation, no second chances. They exist only because that little girl taught me tonight that mercy has value. Street Marcus found his voice again. You're letting us go? I'm giving you the opportunity to live, Daniel corrected. What you do with that opportunity is your choice. But understand this. You're alive because a 6-year-old girl is braver than all of you combined. You're alive because she reminded me that some things are worth protecting. You're alive because eliminating you isn't justice. It's just revenge. He paused, his eyes cold. But I will take revenge if you ever threaten that family again. That's not a warning, it's a promise. The men were hauled out, and Daniel stood alone in the room, his rage slowly cooling into something like purpose. Justice wasn't clean, it wasn't perfect, but tonight, it was enough. Deborah Clarkson woke 3 days after surgery to find her daughter asleep in a chair beside her hospital bed and a bouquet of white roses on the windowsill. The flowers had no card, but the nurse who brought her water mentioned that a man had been by earlier, tall, well-dressed, didn't give his name. He'd paid for the private room, the round-the-clock nursing care, and had left instructions that Mrs. Clarkson was to want for nothing during her recovery. Deborah's memories of that night were fragmented, painful. The attack. Nicole's terrified face as she told her to hide. The darkness that had swallowed everything. Then waking here, in what was clearly not a regular hospital room, but something far more expensive, with her daughter safe beside her. Mama? Nicole stirred, her eyes flying open. You're awake! Baby. Deborah's voice was rough, her throat raw. Are you okay? Did they hurt you? I'm fine, Mama. Nicole climbed carefully onto the bed, mindful of the IV lines and monitors. Mr. Daniel saved us. He sent his doctor and his soldiers, and they got you out and brought you here, and he promised you'd be okay. And you are, Mama. You're okay. Mr. Daniel? Deborah tried to process the rush of words through the fog of pain medication. The boss man, the one with all the black cars. Nicole's expression was serious, reverent. He's nice, Mama. Scary, but nice. He said he'd protect us. Over the next week, as Deborah's strength slowly returned, she pieced together what had happened from Nicole's excited retellings and the careful non-answers from the nursing staff. Her daughter had run through the industrial district and somehow found Daniel Gallion, a name Deborah recognized from neighborhood whispers, from news reports that never quite said what everyone knew. A dangerous man, a powerful man. The kind of man you didn't want noticing you. Except he'd noticed them, and instead of the catastrophe Deborah feared, he'd saved their lives. The medical bills that should have bankrupted them were paid. The apartment, which Deborah couldn't bear to return to, was being professionally cleaned and secured. A social worker visited with paperwork for a new apartment in a different, safer neighborhood. 2 bedrooms, first and last month's rent already covered, security deposit waived. The building had a doorman, actual security, schools nearby that Nicole could transfer to. There's a benefactor, the social worker explained, her expression carefully neutral. Someone who wants to ensure you and Nicole have a fresh start, no strings attached. Deborah knew there were always strings, but when she asked what the benefactor wanted in return, the social worker just smiled sadly. He wants you to be safe. That's all. Daniel visited on Thursday evenings, always after visiting hours when the halls were quiet. He never announced himself, never made demands on Deborah's time or attention. He simply appeared in the doorway like a well-dressed ghost, asked if there was anything they needed, and stayed for exactly 20 minutes before disappearing again. Nicole lit up whenever he arrived, launching into stories about her day with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a child who'd decided someone was safe. She told him about the new school she'd be attending, about the books the hospital volunteer had brought, about how Mama was getting stronger every day. Daniel listened with an attention that seemed almost painful, like he was memorizing every detail. Deborah watched these interactions with mixed emotions. Gratitude, certainly. This man had saved her life and given her daughter a future. But also wariness, because she understood enough about power to know that protection could become possession, that debts could be called in. On his fourth visit, she finally voiced her fear. "Mr. Gallion, I appreciate everything you've done, more than I can say, but I need to know, what do you want from us?" Daniel had been sitting in the visitor's chair, Nicole showing him a drawing she'd made of a house with a garden. He looked up at Deborah with eyes that seemed ancient, tired, carrying losses she could only imagine. "Nothing," he said simply. "I want nothing from you. Nobody does this for nothing." "I do," Daniel said. "Because a very brave little girl ran through a dangerous neighborhood and asked for help when she could have run away. Because she reminded me that power should protect people, not just accumulate more power. Because—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. Nicole had gone back to her coloring, oblivious to the weight of the conversation. "Because I had a daughter once," Daniel continued quietly, "and I failed to protect her. I can't bring her back, but I can make sure Nicole grows up safe. I can make sure you recover and rebuild your life without looking over your shoulder every day. That's what I want, Mrs. Clarkson. Not payment, not obligation, just the knowledge that this time, I was fast enough." Deborah felt tears burning her eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss." "So am I." Daniel stood, preparing to leave. "The new apartment will be ready next week. Security is already in place. You won't see them, but they're there. The neighborhood is now under comprehensive protection. No one will bother you again." "For how long?" Deborah asked. "How long does this protection last?" Daniel looked at Nicole, who'd fallen asleep in her chair, crayons still clutched in her small hand. His expression softened in a way that made him look almost human, almost vulnerable. "Forever," he said. "As long as I'm alive, you and Nicole are protected. That's not a business arrangement, Mrs. Clarkson. It's a promise." He left before Deborah could respond, disappearing into the quiet hospital corridor like he'd never been there at all. Over the following weeks, as Deborah healed and they prepared to move into their new home, Daniel continued his Thursday visits. He never stayed long, never imposed, never asked for anything. He just appeared, checked on them, listened to Nicole's endless stories, and left. Deborah began to understand that Daniel Gallion was a man rebuilding himself through small acts of protection. That saving them had somehow saved him from something darker. That his silent presence every Thursday was as much for his benefit as theirs. She was being protected by a guardian who needed protecting from his own past. And somehow, that made her trust him more than any promises or contracts ever could. On their last night in the hospital, Nicole fell asleep early, exhausted from packing her few belongings. Daniel arrived for his usual visit, found the child sleeping, and started to leave. Stay, Deborah said quietly. Please. I want to thank you properly. Daniel hesitated, then settled back into the visitor's chair. You saved our lives, Deborah said. You gave us a future. I don't know how to repay that. You don't, Daniel said. You just live. You raise your daughter. You be happy. That's all the payment I need. Deborah looked at this dangerous, powerful man who'd somehow become their guardian angel. Then I promise you, she said. We'll live well. We'll be happy. We'll honor what you've given us. Daniel's smile was small but genuine. The first real smile Deborah had seen from him. That's all I ever wanted to hear. 6 months later, Daniel Gallion stood outside Riverside Elementary School, watching Nicole emerge from the building with her new classmates. She wore a backpack almost as big as she was, her hair pulled into neat braids that Deborah had clearly spent the morning perfecting. She was laughing at something her friend said, her face bright with the uncomplicated joy of a 7-year-old who'd left trauma behind and found solid ground again. She spotted Daniel's car. He'd switched from the intimidating black SUVs to a simple sedan for school pickups, and her face lit up even more. She ran to him, her friend waving goodbye, and threw her arms around his waist in the unself-conscious hug that still surprised him every time. Mr. Daniel! I got an A on my spelling test. Miss Rodriguez said I spelled every word perfect. Perfectly, Daniel corrected gently, the same way he'd been correcting her grammar for months. And that's excellent, Nicole. Your mama will be proud. Are you proud? Nicole looked up at him with those brown eyes that still reminded him of Sophia. But the pain of that memory had softened into something bittersweet rather than agonizing. Very proud, Daniel said, and meant it with an intensity that would have shocked his lieutenants. They drove to the apartment, a genuine 2-bedroom in a neighborhood where kids played outside without fear, where corner stores sold groceries instead of serving as fronts for drug operations, where police actually patrolled and people actually called them when trouble started. Daniel had personally selected the location, had his people vet every neighbor, had installed security that was invisible but comprehensive. Deborah was waiting in the doorway when they arrived, wearing scrubs from her new job at the urgent care clinic 3 blocks away. She'd recovered fully from her injuries, though Daniel knew she still sometimes woke from nightmares about that night. But therapy, which Daniel had also arranged and paid for, was helping. She was healing, inside and out. There's my brilliant daughter, Deborah said, pulling Nicole into a hug. A on the spelling test? We're celebrating tonight. I'm making your favorite. Mac and cheese, Nicole announced, then looked at Daniel hopefully. Are you staying for dinner, Mr. Daniel? Mama makes enough for everybody. Daniel had developed a routine over these 6 months. Thursday evening visits had expanded to include school pickups twice a week, weekend trips to the park or the library, and occasional dinners that felt disturbingly normal. He'd been invited into their lives not as the dangerous benefactor, but as something closer to family. It terrified and healed him in equal measure. If your mama doesn't mind the company, Daniel said carefully. He never assumed, never imposed. The boundary between protector and intruder was one he navigated with extreme caution. We'd love to have you, Deborah said, and Daniel could see she meant it. Over 6 months, they'd developed an understanding. She knew what he was, knew the violence and power that defined his world, but she also saw what he was becoming through his relationship with Nicole. She'd told him once that everyone deserved a chance at redemption, and she seemed determined to provide that chance. Inside the apartment, Nicole disappeared to change out of her school clothes while Deborah started dinner. Daniel stood awkwardly in the living room, still not quite comfortable with the domesticity of it all. The apartment was filled with life now. Nicole's drawings on the refrigerator, Deborah's textbooks from the night classes she was taking, photos of them together at the zoo, the park, the museum. Photos that included Daniel in several frames, captured by Deborah's phone when he wasn't paying attention. Him pushing Nicole on a swing. Him reading to her at the library. Him and Nicole feeding ducks at the pond, her small hand in his. A family he hadn't earned but had somehow been given anyway. "You're staring at the photos again," Deborah said from the kitchen. "Having second thoughts about being documented?" "No," Daniel said. "Just trying to figure out how I got here." "You saved us," Deborah said simply. "And then you stayed. That's how you got here." Nicole emerged in pajama pants and a t-shirt, already transitioning into evening mode. She grabbed Daniel's hand and pulled him toward the couch. "Will you read to me before dinner? I got a new book from the library." Daniel sat, and Nicole curled up beside him with the book. Some story about a girl detective solving mysteries. As he read, Nicole providing enthusiastic commentary about the clues she'd noticed, Daniel felt something shift in his chest. This was what Elena and Sophia had felt like. This warmth, this belonging, this sense that something existed beyond deals and territory and calculated power. He'd thought that feeling had died with them, had deliberately killed any capacity to experience it again. But Nicole had brought it back to life, brick by brick, visit by visit, hug by hug. After dinner, macaroni and cheese that Nicole declared the best ever, Daniel helped with dishes while Nicole worked on homework at the kitchen table. The domesticity was surreal for a man whose evenings usually involved strategic planning and violence management. But it was also addictive, this glimpse of a normal life. "She asks about you when you're not here," Deborah said quietly, rinsing a plate. "Wants to know when you're coming back, if you're safe, if you ate dinner. She worries about you." "She shouldn't," Daniel said. "I'm the one who's supposed to protect her." "Protection goes both ways," Deborah said. "You protect her body, she protects your heart. Fair trade, I'd say." When it was time to leave, Nicole hugged him at the door with the fierce intensity of a child who'd learned that people could disappear without warning. "You'll come Thursday?" "I'll come Thursday," Daniel promised. It was the same promise he made every time, and he'd never broken it once. In his car, driving back toward the warehouse and the world of violence and power that still defined most of his existence, Daniel checked his phone. 17 messages from his lieutenants, 2 situations requiring his immediate attention. A territorial dispute that needed resolution before it escalated. The old Daniel would have already been making calls, already calculating the most efficient path to dominance and profit. But the new Daniel, the one who'd been rebuilt by a 6-year-old's courage and a mother's grace, took a moment to just sit in the quiet car and remember what Nicole's laugh sounded like, what Deborah's smile looked like, what it felt like to be part of something that mattered more than power. His phone buzzed again. "Marcus. Urgent." Daniel answered, his voice shifting back into the authority his organization recognized. "What is it?" "Territory issue on the west side. The Mendez crew is pushing boundaries. We need your call." "Handle it," Daniel said. "Minimum force necessary. And Marcus, make sure no civilians are involved. No collateral damage." "Boss, that's going to complicate—" "I don't care. New rules. We don't operate like we used to. We protect our territory without terrorizing the people who live there. Make it work." He ended the call before Marcus could argue. The Cold King was truly dead now, replaced by something more complicated and infinitely more human. A man who ran a criminal empire but did it with rules that honored the lesson a little girl had taught him. Power existed to protect, not to prey. Daniel Gallion had lost his first family to violence, but he'd found his second family through the same violence that had tried to destroy them, and this time, he would do everything right. This time, he would be fast enough, strong enough, present enough. This time, love wouldn't be his weakness, it would be his greatest strength. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss it. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as you can ever imagine.